everyone, my name is Fabria Yaqub. I'm a Bangladeshi organizer based in New York City, and I'm also the programs coordinator for Asian American Writers Workshop. A little bit about us is that for over 30 years, the Asian American Writers Workshop has been dedicated to publishing and amplifying Asian American literary culture. Operating from a radically inclusive ethos, AAWW expands the definition not only of who is a writer, but also of who is an Asian American. Through a robust and diverse lineup of programming, AAWW serves as a vital sanctuary space for writers and readers that works to mobilize the literary community toward a more just future. And this wouldn't be possible without our wonderful friends at Poetry Coalition. This event is part of the Poetry Coalition state of programs in the spring and summer that reflects the transformative impact poetry has on individual readers and communities across the nation, and is made possible in part by the Academy of American Poets with support from the Mellon Foundation. And we're so truly excited for the event that is called Ephemerality Permanence. This event is about poetry that is produced orally and poetry that is written have often been pitted as fundamentally different. The former an ephemeral, inspired process, and the latter thoughtful and elaborated. Oral poems are uttered only to be forgotten if not remembered, while written poems are recorded and edited over and over again until the poet deems them complete. The distinction then extends to how oral and written cultures are understood more generally. In this panel, invited scholars and poets will engage in a far-ranging conversation in which they will use poetry as a lens through which to discuss the way language evolves and changes. What are the differences and similarities between poems produced orally and poems that are written? How does poetry change a written tradition? How does it change an oral tradition? What role does it play in either? So we're so excited to be gathered by wonderful and such powerful scholars and poets with us today. And so first and foremost, we'll be inviting to speak the wonderful Ivanna. Ivanna Sang Een Yi is an assistant professor of Korea Studies at Cornell University. As a scholar of Korean literature, culture, and performance, her research focuses on the performative dimensions of living oral traditions as they interact with written literature and the environment from the 18th century to the present. She has published in the contemporary Korean poetry, the relationship of the Pansori epic storytelling tradition and the more than human world, and the storying of land in the indigenous oral traditions of the Americas. Without further ado, this is Ivanna.
First of all, I'd like to thank Fablia Mohammed and the Asian American Writers Workshop for the kind invitation to participate in this event. I'm speaking to you today from Ithaca, New York, and I would like to acknowledge and thank the Kayagono, the Cayuga Nation, on whose traditional homelands I give this talk. I was delighted to be invited to participate on this panel today because my work grapples with some of the central questions Fablia posed regarding the relationship of orality and literacy. My current book project, Voices Inscribed by Land, Continuing Orality and the Environment in Korean Literature, examines the performative dimensions of Korean oral traditions as they interact with writing and the more than human world. With continuing orality, which I define as the agentic flourishing of oral traditions through transformation, I propose a new model for the relationship between orality and literacy. Whereas orality and literacy have often been placed in a binary, this oral versus written relationship to each other, my work treats literature as a mode of oral performance. I analyze modern and contemporary works of Korean poetry and fiction through the lens of continuing orality to argue that indigenous Korean oral traditions such as pansori, epic dramatic storytelling, shijo, lyric poetry, and muga, shamanic chant, have flourished and proliferated through agentic transformation. One of my case studies examines continuing orality in contemporary Korean poetry, a genre that has repeatedly engaged the pansori oral tradition. I examine a poem by leading contemporary feminist poet Kim Hye-sun called Remembering the Day I Gave Birth to a Daughter. Kim writes directly under the title of the poem, Pansori's 하설조로, which translates to in the melodic mode of pansori narrative. What is a line instructing the reader to imagine pansori music doing in a written text of a poem in the late 20th century? How does this line alter our perceptions and experience of what follows in the poem, which never explicitly mentions pansori again in its narration of childbirth? With the opening line of the poem, Kim signals that this work is an oral performance, asking readers to hear the sound of pansori in their minds. By stepping outside of the voice of the lyric poem speaker and inscribing a directive to the reader, Kim's role here is akin to that of a composer or a conductor. Just as a composer might record specific directions on a score for a future performer on the tempo or the style of a piece of music, Kim indicates how the poem should be read while leaving the semantic content of the poem open to interpretation. With this opening line, in the melodic mode of pansori narrative, Kim creates a new literary melodic mode, extending a tradition in which pansori singers in the late Joseon period developed pansori singing by adding new modes and rhythms. In the first half of the 19th century, often called the Age of the Eight Master Singers, revered pansori singers created unique styles and expanded the musical repertoire and vocabulary. Writing becomes a mode of oral performance for Kim as she simultaneously borrows from the pansori tradition and extends the expressive possibilities of the genre. One of the key shifts that happens with this line in the melodic mode of pansori narrative is a space it creates for the reader to actively engage in the performance of the poem. The word pansori is composed of the prefix pan, a space where people gather, and sori, or sound. When singers set down a straw mat in the open marketplaces or outdoors at village gatherings where pansori was traditionally performed, they opened a pan, a space where people gathered to hear the sounds of pansori. With this line, Kim opens a pan on the page, creating a communal space where people gather for a performance of sori. Invoking the communality of the oral tradition, Kim asks readers to imagine themselves as part of a larger audience. This is just one example in Korean literature where we see orality and literacy not in a binary either-or relationship, but rather literature in action as a mode of oral performance. I look forward to the continuing discussion and also the poetry performances today.
Thank you so much, Ivana. That was absolutely incredible, and I'm so excited for this conversation. Next, we have the incredible Aone van Engelenhoven, who holds a PhD in linguistics from Leiden University, where he now works as a university lecturer in Southeast Asian linguistics. He has published extensively on linguistic topics in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Moluccan diaspora in the Netherlands. Being of Dutch-Indonesian descent, he is bilingual native speaker of Dutch and Indonesian. His present research focuses on the semantics and mnemonics of oral storytelling and poetry and the use of Indonesian and indigenous languages for the transfer of ritual knowledge. His latest publication is an edition on oral traditions in insular Southeast Asia, published at Cambridge Scholars Publishers. Without further ado, this is One.
Yes, it works. So this is Aone van Engelenhoven. I'm very impressed by what Ivanna just said, and I'm not sure if I can do it in the same way. I'm working, as already said, in Southeast Asia, specifically in insular Southeast Asia. And I was called in the beginning of my academic career by oral poetry, specifically from my mother's island in the east. And later on, also the poetry called pantun by the Malays in West Indonesia and in Malaysia. My research is on the difference between, let's call it narrative reality and narration reality, because I live in the Netherlands where we have this tradition of reality being defined by us right now when we speak. So we have ideas about what is real, and everything that does not form according to that is not real. Whereas in the region where I do my research, you have these two realities, narrative reality and narration reality, and both are equally true. This was so interesting because you all of a sudden clash with this phenomenon called truth. I grew up in the Netherlands where things are true or not, whereas over there where I did my research and where my family is from, in principle, everything is true. It just depends on how you want to see it. Another thing that I found interesting is that specifically on the islands in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, there is this tendency to hide your feelings and your emotions. You're not supposed to tell what you think about things. And in order to prevent that, we have small poems to do that instead, through which the hearer or the audience more or less can sense that you're not happy with what you just saw, or that you find it not a good thing that is happening, or perhaps you're very sad. Specifically in the eastern part, on Liti Island, we have a specific poetic language that is very difficult to understand. You have to sing it. And because not everyone understands exactly what it means, making a poem, making an oral poem like that, more or less implies that there is the option for the audience to have different interpretations of what you're saying. And I see this as a typical feature of oral culture. So my research focuses on the phenomenon called orality, and specifically on the semantics of it, because in Indonesia you have 700 different languages. But if you just compare, let's call it the oral literature, then very often it looks the same. I have to watch out here because I get too enthusiastic now. So I would propose that I stop here. I'm very enthusiastic. Thank you, by the way, for the invitation. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aone. I'm so excited for all of this and to learn more about your work. Next but not least, we have the incredible poet that will be joining us with part of the conversation, but also a reading with us. We have Craig Santos Perez, who is an indigenous Chamorro from the Pacific island of Guam. He is the author of 7 books of poetry and the co-editor of 9 anthologies. Here we have Craig.
Afade, thank you so much to everyone at the Asian American Writers Workshop for organizing this event. I'm going to share a few poems from my forthcoming collection entitled Call This Mutiny. And these poems all relate to kind of the relationship between orality and textuality, or the oral and the written. This first poem is titled Ars Pacifica. When the tide of silence rises, say ocean. Then with the paddle of your tongue, rearrange the letters to form canoe. And that brief poem comes out of the realization that the words ocean and canoe have the same letters, and thinking about how both our tongues and writing or poetry as a metaphor for the tongue, or an extension of the tongue, allows us to both navigate silence and speech. The second poem is the title poem entitled Call This Mutiny. And it was written on the 500-year anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe and arrival to Guam in 1521. Call This Mutiny. My refusal to praise the first circumnavigation of the globe and to herald your name bestowed upon ships, waterways, and galaxies. Call this mutiny, my retelling of the story from our perspective, Chamorros standing on the shores of Guam, sighting 3 monstrous ships. They boarded outrigger canoes and flew towards first contact. The date, March 6, 1521, according to your calendar, not ours, in the year of your Lord, not ours. Call this mutiny. We discovered you, lost and drifting in our already named ocean. We saved you, diseased and starving. Yet you mistranslated trade as theft, branded us ladrones, thieves. You disembarked, burned a village, and killed 7 of our people. First, violence. Call this mutiny. My refusal to affirm that you put Guam on the map. You put us in the crosshairs of empire. Our history did not begin with your arrival. We navigated this sea long before you ventured beyond continents. Call this mutiny. My refusal to believe Guam is destiny's landfall, that your presence was manifest by the divine doctrine of discovery. We weren't destined to be the first colony in the Pacific, used as a port for the galleon trade between Acapulco and Manila. We weren't destined to be baptized in our own holy blood by the sharp edge of the cross. You called us thieves, but it was your people who looted the world. You called us savage, but it was European civilization that mastered savagery. Call this mutiny, because today I commemorate Guam as more than a mere dot in the latitudes and longitudes of imperial history. I commemorate the quincentennial of Chamorro's thriving beyond the vicious wake of your voyage. I commemorate Chamorro resilience, which is so vast, no armada of galleons can ever circumnavigate. So I wanted to share that poem, partly because it kind of extends and uses many techniques in orature, such as, of course, repetition. And so you hear the kind of repetition of call this mutiny as kind of the narrative thrust throughout the poem. Okay, this next piece is titled Memorial Day. And it has a little quote from the beginning. Epigraph, it says, Guam has one of the highest enlistment rates among US states and territories, and has one of the highest concentrations of military veterans. 1 in 8 adults on Guam have served in the armed forces, end quote. Memorial Day. America declares federal holiday. We mourn daily. America celebrates 3-day weekend. We recite 9-day prayers. America marks beginning of summer. Grief is our endless season. America parades. We dust photo albums. America blooms flowers and fireworks. We wilt and ashes. America observes a moment of silence. We miss their voices. America visits national cemeteries. We mass graves. America waves its flags, our flags tightly folded. America sings land of the free. We whisper continent of thieves. America says recruiter's paradise. We. America dons uniforms. We covered in shrouds. America pledges allegiance. Our heartbeats a continuous gun salute. America recounts names of the dead. We count stolen generations. America ignores veterans. We read their suicide notes. America commands, be all you can be. We ask, when will we ever be whole? And so that poem, of course, uses repetition as well, but I wanted to share it today because it also has the technique of call and response, which is very common, especially in indigenous oratures. Okay, my final poem is also the final poem of this forthcoming book. The poem is titled The Pacific Written Tradition. I read aloud from my new book to an English class at one of Guam's public high schools. Afterwards, a student is crying. "What's wrong?" I ask. She says, "I've never seen our culture in a book before. I just thought we weren't worthy of literature." I wonder how many young islanders have dived into the depths of a book only to find bleached coral. We were taught that missionaries were the first readers in the Pacific because they could decipher the strange signs of the Bible. We were taught missionaries were the first authors because they possessed the authority of written words. Today, studies show that Islander students read and write below grade level. It's natural, experts claim. Your ancestors were an illiterate oral people. Do not believe their claim. Our ancestors deciphered signs in nature, interpreted star formations and sun positions, cloud and wind patterns, wave currents, and ocean efflorescence. That's why Master Navigator Papa Mao once said, quote, "If you can read the ocean, you will never be lost," end quote. Now let me tell you about Pacific written traditions, how our ancestors tattooed their skin with scripts of intricately inked genealogies, how they carved epics into hard wood with a sharpened point, their hands, and the pressure of memory, how they stenciled petroglyphic lyrics on cave walls with clay, fire, and smoke. So next time someone tells you our people were illiterate, teach them about our visual literacies, our ability to read the intertextual sacredness of all things. And always remember, if we can write the ocean, we will never be silenced. And so I just wanted to conclude my reading with that poem, partly to show that, our ancestors, even though they're depicted as often being purely or merely oral literature and only composing orature, I would argue, and many other indigenous scholars make this argument as well, that our ancestors also had written traditions. It just wasn't necessarily alphabetic. And so I just wanted to bring that into the conversation as well. But thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Craig, so, so much. I literally have chills all over my body. Your poetry is just so incredibly powerful, and I hope everyone gets to check out Craig's incredible poetry and upcoming for their book as well. So super excited for that. Thank you so much. So we have another poet that's going to be joining us today and also will be moderating this wonderful conversation. So we have with us Jan Henry Gray. Jan Henry Gray is the author of documents, BOA editions, selected by D.A. Powell as the winner, A. Poulin Junior Poetry Prize, and Chapbook Selected Emails, Spect Books. He received fellowships from Kundiman and DocuPoets and the Cook Foundation. He was born in the Philippines and has lived in San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and Brooklyn. He's an assistant professor at Adelphi University in New York. We have Jan.
Hi, everyone. Again, thank you, Fabliha, for hosting. Thank you, everyone at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and to all of our guests. Looking forward to the conversation. I have a few poems to read before we do. I'm a poet. My first book, Documents, came out a few years ago, and I'm currently working on the second book. As someone who lived in the United States and documented for close to 32 years, a lot of my work, especially a lot of the work in the first book, Documents, is about, yes, the experience of being undocumented in the United States, but also really questions the role of documentation, how we document ourselves, how we write about ourselves, how we sort of scribe ourselves to where we are. So a sense of place is really central to the work. And as sort of, I'm going to use the word punishment, as one of the punishments of living undocumented here for so long, one of the things that was kind of remarkable about that time was not being able to go back to the Philippines for a very long time. So the sort of migrant and diasporic experience was really sort of exacerbated by that. And so the sort of sense of loss and sense of reaching maybe back toward where you come from, where one comes from, is central to the book. A big part of the book too is working with repurposing government forms. So there's a lot of use of found text and erasure collage. The first poem I'll read is, I like to say, a poem I didn't write, in part because there are two elements in it. One is language taken specifically from the immigration form, the I-797C form, and the other element in the poem are questions my immigration lawyer told me I should prepare for the immigration interview. And so I'll read a few poems from the book, and I'll read a little bit of the newer work. I-797C, Notice of Action. Requests for applicant to appear for initial interview. Application number MSC ending in 058. A number ending in 961. Notice date July 24th, 2014. Date of arrival February 20th, 1984. Hereby notified to appear. How often do you have sex? To adjust status. What color is his toothbrush? His birth certificate. What side of the bed does he sleep on? Resident alien. How much does he make? Your husband must come with you. What's his mother's name? We may videotape you. Where did you buy your rings? Bring an interpreter. What are his siblings' spouses' names? In a sealed envelope, bring what's his father's name? Failure to appear. What's his father's name? Please appear as scheduled below. Do you love him? Supporting evidence. Why do you love him? Tuesday, March 17th, 2015, 8 a.m., USCIS, Chicago, Illinois. Don't mention citizenship. Talk about love. How you got married for love. This next poem is called Missing Documents, and this was one of the sort of central poems. There's not quite a title poem in the book, but this is one of the central poems in the book. And yes, it owes a lot of gratitude towards Craig Santos Perez's work in its sort of use and repurposing of the forms around you, the documentation and forms of documentation around you. And the poem ends with, I would say, overheard language out of the poetry workshop model or the writing workshop model. So it sort of combines various pieces. And there are two epigraphs inside the poem. I won't be saying their names, but the first one is by Matthew Shinoda, and the second is by C.S. Giscombe. Missing document. February 1984, Quezon City, Philippines. Documents, copies of I-94, missing. Supporting information, flight number, date of departure, seat numbers of the family members, missing. Tell the story of somewhere else. ISBN 9781566891738. I had a taste for ambiguity and arrival. ISBN 978-156-478-1840. Her hand did not wave. Her hand was ice, ice set to the temperature of the air between the sand pressed to make the glass window she stood behind next to the wood door, the heavy wood door that I can't say for sure was oak, but am certain was heavy, oiled, ridged, with a gold doorknob that looked like what we were told gold looked like. Gold, the color, not the ore, not AU or dollar sign, or what fills the vaults in the movies my mother's father watches on Sundays. Awake in the 6 a.m., 5 a.m., 4 a.m. dark. His cigarette burning, a kind of dying orange sunrise light. Her hand against the glass, my mother's sister's hands, or maybe they were Maya Daren's hands. Something's getting in the way. We can't say for certain. My mother's name is Rebecca. Focus, tell us about her hand. What do you see? Ground us in the work, in the details. Go there. Really take us somewhere. This third poem from the book is called The Dream Act. And I know a sort of centerpiece of what we're talking about today is oral and written. And one of the one of my obsessions in this book, but sort of in general, is material. As poets, sometimes can be easy to maybe undersell or under prioritize just how important material is, because writing sort of happens, on bits of paper, on computers, etc. And so we don't often require a lot of space to write poems, or there's not a lot of material fees, a lot of actual physical objects required to write. There's that idea. And so the sort of sensual world, but also the kind of material world. And very specifically, I'm talking about like paper, how important paper is, not only to poetry, but specifically to the role of citizenship, applying for citizenship, government forms. The more you participate or engage or are forced to engage with this kind of stuff, the more paper the more the amount of paper you realize kind of is part of this process. This is called the Dream Act. There is a garage underneath the house. The house has an address. The garage does not. There is a door cut into the garage door. This is the entrance for the family. The garage is underneath the house. One night, the father meets another father who owns the house. They talk about the place downstairs, the garage underneath the house. The family moves into the garage. The family lives there for the year. The garage is underneath the house. The father brings home a tree. The family calls it a Christmas tree. The tree is propped on a table. There is no address, but there is a telephone line. The mother is on the phone with her mother. The mother is describing the house. The garage is underneath the house. The children decorate the tree with ornaments made of paper. I'm currently working on the second book, and I'm thinking a lot about and working a lot in sort of the fragment, thinking a lot about the role of the fragment for the migrant person, for the migrant writer, for the migrant scholar, and thinking about the role. And really what I'm saying is sort of our relationship to the fragment, the sort of broken line, the lack of continuity is so much a part of our experience, and how much that informs how we see the world and how we interact with the world. And so a lot of these poems are thinking about, or by thinking about that, I mean very, very specifically, a lot of the forms are really fragmented forms that I've sort of collapsed and mashed together in these sort of prose block things, sort of kind of fake sort of sense of unity or wholeness. It's thinking a lot about Americanness, and the world that is most proximate to you, and the world that you come to understand, and how we come to understand what's close to us and what's far, and trying to do that in these new poems. I'll read one, and this will be my last poem before we talk together. On your first trip abroad with a US passport, 44 years old. How you want to go back. Greens with little else. Suspense at customs. To prove a point. Learning the pace of afternoons. Gin-soaked cucumbers. Black bread. Handsome men. Walking without taking photographs. It feels like California. You're waiting for the train. You're on the train. Window seat. From the balcony, you can see the Mediterranean. Soft cheese, steamed fish. How much Tagalog you heard on the streets. How cheap it was to eat. Meat hung on the hook. Because you'd rather not. Because you were ineligible to travel like this. Because you understand slowness, process, government inefficiency, smaller portions. No one drank from the tap. Yes to the house wine, yes to a time called vermouth hour. All of it fades away more often and throughout the day. Perfect pudding, the beaches, the bronze nakedness, the newness of travel, the ethics of tourism. If it's really important, you'll find out the name of the ripe summer melon. More flight than fight. Hotel room refrigerator, an empty familiarity, stuffed octopus, expertly prepared. How much your Spanish returned. Your relationship to time and languages. How easy it all was. Of course, you leave the hard parts out. Your deep resentment at not having seen the world sooner. A journey reduced to an anecdote. What do you want to eat tonight? How was your trip? It's been so long. Okay, thank you for listening. We're going to shift gears and have a conversation between the four of us. So I believe I'm inviting everyone to turn their cameras on. Okay. Thank you for, getting all of us really in a way like started, but also already, like knee deep in these like really great conversations. We're talking about, and I love, Ivanna, that you really kind of started out by like laying the foundation of, the idea and the sort of practice of orality, the written word versus the oral is not a binary, and sort of doing so sort of, kind of traps us into this like overly simplistic thinking. But can each of you talk a little bit about, we all probably already know that and sort of understand that. Can you all talk about a little bit about why that relationship is so important? Craig, you mentioned how a lot of this is sort of central to your new book. And Ona, you talk about, this really kind of at the core, this is how we come to know ourselves and sort of interact with each other, this idea of, I think you called it narrative reality. Can all of you talk about why this conversation and why this tension between these two are so important, and why it's still so important?
I'd be glad to just give a few thoughts first. Thanks so much for everyone's wonderful poetry and One. I really appreciated your remarks as well. Yeah, I think that this is a really important question for us to be thinking about because historically, right, orality and literacy have not only been seen in this binary either or construction, but also a teleological construction. So the idea that over time, humanity makes this progress. And as Craig mentioned in his work, societies that didn't have a particular kind of writing were seen as not being quote unquote civilized, right? And there's this imperial discourse that happens not only in Asia, but as we know, in the Americas as well, and across the Pacific. So this is an important conversation for us to be thinking about, because when we think about the oral and written in this binary, it reinforces that idea. And I love how Craig really highlighted the ways in which there are other forms of the written that Indigenous peoples were engaging in. There's also birch bark writings, and I love how you highlighted tattoo art as one method as well. So I think that breaking that binary, not only in terms of thinking about this either or dimension, but that this is a historical progress narrative that we, can impose onto Indigenous peoples. In the context of Korea, when Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910 to 1945, this period was difficult, partly because of the suppression of the Korean language, and Koreans were forced to take on Japanese names and speak the Japanese language. And the discourse was that Korea was so backward that Japan, which had already opened up to the West, was coming in and going to civilize the population, right? So there was a form of Japanese settler colonialism that happened in Korea as well at that time. So yeah, I think it really helps put into perspective the longstanding agency of Indigenous peoples to tell their stories through writing and through the oral tradition, not in this either or, but in a both and kind of construction.
I'll just, I definitely agree with everything that was just said, and it applies really deeply to the Pacific, as this binary, was also part of the kind of a racial project, as was said, to cast Pacific Islanders as backwards and uncivilized and in need of both, saving and of Western concepts of literacy. And what's really interesting in 20th century, as contemporary Pacific Islander literature, written literature started to emerge, short stories, novels, and poetry. A lot of those Pacific authors were arguing that our written literature is an extension of our oral literature, and many of the same techniques, like repetition, anaphora, call and response, can be used as techniques within the written literature, can help shape a novel's narrative, for example. And there's one scholar, poet, Epeli Ha'ofa from Tonga, who describes our written literature, or reading our written literature, as listening to invisible storytellers. So even reading is reimagined as kind of a oral experience as well. And I always found that really powerful, both how Indigenous writers are, kind of translating oral techniques into, written literature, but also, how we are conceptualizing or reconceptualizing, what writing is, what textuality is, and kind of the possibilities of orality, within written text.
So I'm not very technical, as you see. So, so I'm the only one around here who does something that is not literate at all. No writing, only oral. And to show you how, because I'm from a little island culture in the east of Indonesia, how we deal with poetry is, for example, Craig just gave his poem, and that was a very sad poem about the missionaries more or less imposing this idea that where they came from and that they are much better than the ones who are on the island, right? So that's more or less the idea, and this feeling is more or less adopted also by the people on the island, by Guam, and you are actually telling that you shouldn't do that, more or less. Now, in the culture I'm from, I have to react on the moment that Craig says his poem. I do not say anything. It means I've lost. So I need to reply. Now, when Craig came up with the poem, the first thing I thought, oh yeah, no, don't think like that. So the first thing I thought was in Malay, we would say something like, we have very short poems, 4 lines only. It would be something like, so I do this in Malay, right? Pisang emas, bawa berlayar. Masak sebiji di atas peti, hutang emas bisa dibayar, hutang budi dibawa mati. So it's about bananas. You take a trip on the boat, you have to take bananas along. It's all islands, right? So you take bananas along. But if you take a good look, there is this bunch of bananas on the boat, but they are already very ripe. If you are from an island culture, you know you are going to take the boat. Do not take along bananas that are already very ripe, because on the moment that you leave, your bananas are rotten. You can't eat them anymore, right? So that it starts off with that, and that's already an indication. Then the third line says, well, you know, if you have to pay gold to people, you have to pay gold, but you can pay that. That's okay. But on the moment that you have a promise of budi, and I can't translate that into English, or neither in Dutch. It's something very deep. It is knowledge of language. It's general knowledge. If you have to pay budi, you have to carry that until you're dead. So Malay culture goes like, I need to have as much budi as possible. So on the moment that I help someone, I don't want to get anything for that. No. I don't want to get anything for that. But I want you to remember that I helped you. That's what I want you to do. And that makes me strong. So on the moment that these missionaries came to the island and they take away everything and they more or less impose everything on you, my first reply would be, but you have the budi, you're the strong one. It's your place, it's yours. They are the foreigners. They will never be yours. You have the budi, don't cry about it. That's how in an oral society, you have to deal with poetry. The problem is, of course, it's not written down. So the thing is that you have to memorize these lines, because specifically in Pantun poetry, you have to be really quick. Someone has a poem, the person is very sad, then I have to say something nice, right? But I can't say something nice because we don't do that. We don't pronounce our emotions. We don't do that. So we make a poem. And then I just say something, yeah, okay, it's okay, because you have the budi, you are from there, it's yours. Never mind, you still win. Don't take the banana that is rotten, leave it. So that's more or less the way we think about things. So like Jan's poem, this one that was really sad about that you have to have this form, and they're asking these things and everything. Also, I get this sentiment, but from our island in the east, so that's not Malay. We also have very small poems, but we have to sing it. You can't do it like it's an oral thing. I even don't know how to write it down. But when Jen came up with that, I thought I need to have a reply here. That would be Okumano makana isio lo pasirio gawano melong aria muliria veyo oro make romano. I learned this poem when I went for field work there. You know, stupid language, what do? They ask people, can you say it like this? Can you say it like that? Is this still correct? And then this one uncle, when I came there once, he was walking on the beach and he saw me coming. And I thought, so are you happy to see me? Can we go eat somewhere? And then he didn't say anything, but then he gave me this poem. And I didn't know what to do with that. I had to ask my mom later on, what was happening? And then my mom said, oh, this is a poem about a crab, a hermit crab. Your uncle says, you look like the hermit crab. I see you coming from distance and I see your colors and I like it. But I already know when you're going to start to ask your questions, I don't know the answer. And it hurts me every time I see you, because then I remember that I forget my language. So I was kind of, I didn't know how to deal with it. I thought, is he happy or is he not happy with me? Well, actually he was happy, but he was also not happy with me because I asked these things that just reminded him that he had forgotten so much. So this is how that works in an oral society. You hear a poem, it creates a sentiment, an emotion, and then you have to reply to that. On the moment that you don't do that, then where I'm from, people feel very uncomfortable. Okay.
A big part of the role is to reply. We have to reply to each other. You know, maybe, you know, Craig mentioned call and response as maybe one of the most earliest forms of replying to poets in a live space. And Ivanna, can you give us a little bit more? You mentioned it. Is it pansori, right? Can you say a little bit about that? Because you know, talking about how the words translate to space and sound. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what we're talking about here is how poetry often becomes a space of really fertile kind of ground to play, experiment, and think through these like really big questions of, you know, yes, language, but also, I mean, I think documentation and the idea of visibility, literacy, legibility, all kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about that very particular Korean tradition and why, you know, the sort of, I think there's a sort of tension there with how the space is the page, but the space is also the public spaces and how that is, you know, part and parcel to how poetry is kind of keeps going.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks so much for that excellent question, Jan. Yeah, as you pointed out, pansori literally means this space where people gather to hear sound, and I think that it's really remarkable how contemporary poets have used that very similar framework to think about poetry as a place for gathering people and for sharing sounds and even a musical performance on the page in Korea and also as evidenced in Craig's work across different cultures. And I think what's really powerful for me when I think about pansori in particular, it's this epic tradition that was created by the lower classes in the late Joseon dynasty. So the first recorded instance that we have of it, which came from an upper class person, because the lower classes didn't know how to write in classical Chinese. There's a long history that I won't go into right now, but basically classical Chinese was the lingua franca of East Asia, and Korea used classical Chinese for written documents like poetry, and language of politics was all written in classical Chinese until quite late in its history, following the Japanese colonization. The Korean script, which had already been invented in the 15th century, finally came back into circulation as a formal language of letters. But that's all a footnote to say that this oral tradition, which was created by the lower classes, when you look at these stories, one of these stories is the most famous is called The Tale of Chunhyang, and it's about a young woman who is from the lower class, and a man from the upper class falls in love with her, and they have this secret marriage. And he later abandons her while he goes on a civil service exam in Seoul. She's from Namwon, which is in the southern area of the peninsula. And you see the really harsh treatment of the lower classes of the upper classes on the lower classes. And that is actually embedded in this oral story, which then becomes patronized by the upper classes starting in the 19th century. So it's really kind of telling when when in the 19th century, when these stories become reshaped into these Neo-Confucian virtue tales, the tale of Chunhyang becomes transformed into this tale of female chastity and virtue. But you peel back the layers and you see that actually this woman is being treated really badly by this upper class man. And that history of social critique is then used in the democratization movement when in the 1960s and 70s, when Korea it was actually quite a bloody battle for democracy in Korea. It's known as, one of the world's democracies today, but there was a lot of unrest and social movements. Students were actually at the forefront of many of those protests that finally secured electoral democracy for Korea in the 1980s. So when contemporary poets are using pansori, they actually are using layers of that history. And the critique that the poet that I mentioned, Kim Hye-sun, when she calls these readers into her birthing room, basically, she's creating this feminist community of readers, and the social critique that she has of this patriarchal society that oftentimes has marginalized not only Korean women writers, but Korean women at large. That social critique is built is layered onto that history of critique of class struggle as well. So it's really powerful to me to see that continuing wave of how pansori has been used over time, and how that the meaning just accrues as well. And so when you read this poem from the late 20th century, you kind of glimpse into all of that struggle from the late Joseon dynasty to the present.
Yeah, how else are we thinking about, especially thinking about, oral and written and the kinds of spaces that are important, and how much, and I'm saying spaces, but I'm thinking about, I'm thinking in terms of class, in terms of access, really the simplest version of the question is a question that I think about often about poetry is, how do people come into contact with it? Many of us I teach poetry, and one of my first questions to the students is often, what was your first contact with poetry? Sometimes it's a a poem on the subway, on a wall, in a museum. Sometimes it's, you know, a parent or someone in the family read it to them. And sometimes it is, you know, through faith, church, song, etc. Can you all talk about a little bit about the kinds of like spaces that you think of in particular? You know, yes, poetry is a space, but sort of like maybe some physical spaces that you think of as incredibly critical for the many kind of traditions that poetry has.
Oh, it's open, yeah. Uh, um, yeah, there's, well, Indonesia, it's an enormous country, right? There's quite a difference between the East and the West. Yeah, let's call it a literate society, because Islam came in very early. So, and with Islam coming in, you had writing immediately. If you go to the East, in the East, they are mostly Christians. So and then you get this difference between literacy and orality. When it's literate, when it's written down, it's almost a religious thing. Everyone can read and write because everyone learns to read and write in school, but it's a different register. You use writing for a specific thing. But when you're talking serious stuff, then it's oral. And then it turns out that you, at least where I work, you have a totally different set of rules. Also here in the Netherlands, with the Moluccan community in the Netherlands, it turns out that on the moment that they speak, then you have different rules to follow. It turns out that partly you cannot do that in Dutch, for example. You have to swap to Indonesian. And I always wondered why that is. It turned out my children told me that I do the same thing, but I didn't realize that. But on the moment, for example, if I would get angry with a child because he did something, it would be easier to explain to the person like what he did in Indonesian instead of in Dutch. Somehow it doesn't work. Or when you're talking about food, it sounds better in Indonesian than in Dutch. It doesn't sound good in Dutch. So you have these registers, and semantically there is something wrong there. My daughter told me a few years ago when I hurt my leg, and then I explained that to her. Well, I hurt my leg, and I said something like, "My leg is dizzy." Then my daughter said, "Dad, this is not okay in Dutch. Your leg cannot be dizzy. If dizzy is in your head, not in your leg. But in Indonesian, it's fine to have a dizzy leg. That's okay. Because dizziness is a kind of emotion. But for my daughter said, no, it's absolutely not acceptable. You cannot say your leg is dizzy in Dutch. On the moment when I heard that, I started to think like, but does that imply that when I speak Dutch to a person, that we can misunderstand each other because we're using different meanings, although the sound is the same? And that explains, for example, that a lot of Indonesians who come here to study at Leiden University, they have to write their thesis in English, right? And very often, it happened to me several times as well, I can read the English all right, but I could not understand what it said. And I still don't understand what is happening here, because they just learned English in school. So their English should be okay. They can communicate in English, but then they write something down, it's in English, and then I can't follow anymore. So somehow there is this difference between literacy and orality, because you have to follow different lines. For example, in Dutch, if you want to write a paper in Dutch, you have to follow certain strict rules. Also in English, you're not allowed to write enormous long sentences, right? That's not cool. You have to, if you write something academic, short sentences, to the point, go, 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 go. Yeah, well, I have Italian students, they love to write enormous sentences with a lot of commas and whatever, and I was still looking for the end of the sentence, but I can't find. This is related to literacy also on a certain moment. But when we speak, like what I'm doing, my sentences are super long because short sentences from the culture where I'm from, it's not polite. You can't answer with yes or no. No, you have to get, well, you're from the Philippines, Jan, and you have to give a whole extended answer. Yes or no is not okay because it doesn't mean anything. You have to furnish it. You have to put extra on it, but that doesn't mean that everything that you say is basic to your message. And I think this is also the issue in poetry. Yeah, the poems that you gave us, those are long poems from where I'm from. Those are long poems, but you have to go into the text in order to find out what is actually the emotion that you want to let us know, right? So I think this is related to the difference between orality and literacy. On the moment that we write things down, we have this tendency to look for what is true. That's a very Western thing. This is correct. This is true. I have this problem in the Netherlands. You see this with Moluccan Christians who have a problem with the fact that sometimes they read something in the Bible and then it does not fit what their grandparents told them about the creation of the world, because their grandparents never said it was 7 days. But the Bible says in Genesis 7 days. And then because you grew up over here, the question pops up, who is correct? The Bible must be correct, right? Because it's written down, then it's correct. But that would imply that my granddad is not correct, but it's your granddad. That's an old person. So if you're from the Austronesian world, an older person is always right. And then you have this clash going on. This is what you see in the Moluccan community in the Netherlands, that people get confused, but uncertain very often. Even if you have Moluccan students going to class and you ask them something, can you explain the paper? Did you read the paper? Can you explain what it is about? Then they say, yes, I can. And actually, you don't really get an answer. Whereas if you ask a Dutch student, then you get exactly, it's like this and this and this and this and this and this. This is the gist of the paper. This is what the author means. But very often Moluccan students can't really do that somehow, but they can react like, yeah, that's correct. But they are not capable of doing that. So this is the intriguing part for me. But Korea, that's a really literate society, right, Ivanna? That's a really literate society. So I think that your view on things is different from where I'm from.
And I'll just add, Jen, to your question. For me, growing up on Guam, my earliest memories of poetry is actually nursery rhymes, and the common nursery rhymes that are heard across the Anglophone world, and they have a lot of rhyme, certain kind of rhythm to it. So it was very easy to remember and to memorize because it had all these mnemonic devices. Guam is also a very Catholic island, so I was able to hear a lot of poetry in church and of course in the Bible. So, for me, that was when I first started seeing that relationship between, orality and then, textuality. Going to school in Guam, Guam's a U.S. territory, so we have very colonial school system. So, I was taught, American and British poetry. Much of which also had those same mnemonic devices, end rhymes, certain, set formal rhythms and so on. So we even had exercises in school where we had to memorize, certain romantic British poets or American poets like Robert Frost, for example. It really, and then of course, You know, growing up in a U.S. colony, you know, we listened to a lot of American pop music. And so, you know, listening to whether it be country western or African-American hip hop, you know, those to me were also poetry, you know, lyric poems, and, you know, easy to memorize because they also had rhyme and a lot of anaphora and certain kind of rhythms and refrains and so on. And so that was kind of my first introduction to poetry, was really, you know, strongly influenced by those oral elements. And really wasn't until later when I started studying, you know, modernist and postmodern poetry that moves away from a lot of that style, where I started thinking, you know, more deeply about textuality and kind of deconstructing the text and documents like you do so powerfully. And one thing I'll add also is that, you know, I was never taught my own people's orature because of, you know, because of Guam's colonial situation. And, you know, the only storytelling I was really surrounded by was my elders, my parents and grandparents, you know, sitting around the table and what we call talking story, right? Just telling their own stories of their lives and hearing their voices and, you know, just trying to dissect their own storytelling techniques and their own narrative devices that they were using, and just trying to absorb that. And then, you know, as a poet, trying to then, you know, translate all of that experience into my own work, and, you know, kind of explore the intersections between those oral and written traditions, as well as, of course, the colonial, global, and indigenous traditions that I've inherited as well.
Yeah, because Craig, you know, in one of those poems, I believe it was maybe your last poem, when you have the students saying, realizing that they've never seen their stories in the book. This is we all know, a very common experience, for, you know, for marginal people, and all kinds of people. Can you talk about, you know, a little bit about the maybe I don't know, responsibility, maybe duty that you feel in 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 you know, because that's the work of storytellers, it's the work of scholars, it's the work of poets, it's the work of artists, is, you honest, accurate representation, you know, to sort of spread the story. That's so, circulation is a big part of how, you know, literatures gain their power. But can you talk about that moment? You know, this is a common moment. Many students have this, many people have this, in and out of the classroom, of finally seeing yourself, finally hearing a version of yourself, seeing something familiar or individually legible to you. Can you all talk about that role in the written and the oral, how that's the sense of seeing oneself becomes even more magnified?
I have a quick follow-up question to that, Jan, because it's such a rich question. And in particular, I wanted to ask Craig, because you were just talking about the talking story, the stories that you would hear from your families and from your family and your elders. I'm curious about your process when you're incorporating that into your poems, how you go about piecing those parts in, and yeah, if it's kind of a conscious, kind of deliberate practice at that point to try to reflect those stories in a way that honors them.
Yes, thank you for that. You know, part of it is trying to reconstruct these stories from memory, which of course then comes out very fragmented. So I also, you know, work with the fragment a lot in my poetry. And I've also been fortunate to both to interview, do oral interviews with my grandparents. And so, you know, to honor their voice and their own storytelling techniques, you know, I would honestly just transcribe what they told to me, and then I would try to kind of replicate their silences or pauses, like on the page, using, of course, you know, blank space. And you know, so in that way, I feel like, you know, I both try to remember what was told to me as best I could, but then also, you know, knowing that I can never kind of completely recover that memory, then want to take the opportunity to just interview them so they can speak for themselves. And I could then, as a poet, include their voices or incorporate their voices into my work, as it was told to me. And then to Jan's question, yeah, definitely. There's so much obviously decolonial potential in Pacific and indigenous literature, and for me, so much of my work is trying to highlight those decolonial politics as as we think about stories in the Pacific, we kind of describe them as vessels, as canoes that carry a lot of valuable lessons and values and cultures, as well as history and politics, and of course important knowledge about bananas and stuff like that. And so for me, I definitely see my poems in that way, as vessels that will help the next generation to continue navigating experience and history.
We are we are wrapping up. We have maybe a couple minutes. And I have hopefully a short question, and it's maybe especially perhaps useful for the scholars and teachers out there. It's a pedagogical question. How can each of you maybe give us like one, I don't know, sort of maybe tip or sort of thing to think about in terms of how to preserve and keep intact, maybe depending on where we are and how we teach and where we teach. This is already sort of foregrounded, but are there ways in which you try to foreground and preserve the value of orality? I mean, I think for so many people, it can feel like a lost cause. But are there ways in which are tools that you use or tips or ways in which you kind of make sure to foreground that and preserve that as a rich tradition?
Can I reply to that? Because it's related also to what Craig just said. Here in the Netherlands, we have this migrant community, or actually it's a community of exiles, and they come from different places, but it's the fact that they share this military history, that the Dutch people consider them to be one group, but they are not. It's 3 ethno-linguistic groups, but the Dutch consider them to be just one group. Through time, what you see happening is that because they live in a literate society, everything oral is seen as not okay. It's pathetic. It's things that you should forget. Make sure that you can read and write. Then you can have your career. But an oral thing is not okay. Added to that is what you see very often is that people are afraid of it. They are afraid that they make a mistake. Oh, I heard the story of my granddad. I don't know the name exactly of the ancestor anymore. Let's not talk about it anymore. So my duty now is that I teach not only my students in the university, but also people in the museum, the Moluccan Museum, how to deal with this. They need to learn that a term like secrecy is something that we invent, more or less. A story in principle is not secret, because if it's a secret story, then it's not going to be told. That's nonsense. The basic of a story is that you have to tell it. That's the basis. So this whole secrecy thing, that's made up. That's made up because people think that, oh no, I'm a good Protestant, so I don't want to tell you that this ancestor flew through the air. That's nonsense. That's heathen stuff. No, I don't want that. We have to learn, that also applies to me, we have to learn that it's not like that. In the old days, we had these stories, they were functional. If you want to be proud of your culture, you should be proud of these types of storytelling. What we see happening in the Netherlands is that it's totally disappearing. What you see happening is that people very often look at dances and whatever kind of visual thing, and that's what they focus on. But then just the talking, they don't see that as something important. But it's just take a for example, I have to be quick in this one. If you would have two Moluccan youngsters talking about a football game or a soccer game, this is America, you talk about a soccer game, it sounds totally different. If they do it, or two Dutch people do it, that's boring. But the two Moluccans, if they tell you about the football game, you are there. You don't have to see it on television anymore. You see it happening. Oh my goodness. How horrible was that? That's what I would call that is oral culture. You you should cherish that, because on the moment that if you're a migrant, you end up in the literate society, a big chance that this get lost. And my task is to show them that this is something you should be happy about. Don't throw it away. Okay, I stop preaching now.
That's really wonderful, Aone. I love the idea that we need to tell these stories, and that's one way to continue these traditions. You know, I feel similarly. I had the real honor to be able to study with a Pansori teacher when I was doing my field work. Her name is Che Soo-jung, and she was incredibly generous to me and taught me some Pansori songs, and we would also go, I was studying with her at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, and then we also went to mountainous locations. It's called Mountain Study, 산공부, where Pansori singers engage in this dialogic relationship with the more than human, singing at waterfalls and into the mountains. And it was a really powerful experience for me. And I wanted to do something where I could replicate that in miniature for my students, you know, because I wanted them to understand that Pansori is not simply something that is on the page. We have these anthologies. This Tale of Chunhyang, which I mentioned earlier, is anthologized in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. But it, you know, in a sense, it's really disembodied when it's simply this textual form. And so we listen to recordings, we listen to performances on YouTube. But one of the special things I was able to do was take my students to, actually, here in Ithaca, we have a lot of waterfalls. So it's a great location to teach Pansori. And I took them to Chirphammer Falls, which is a waterfall right on campus. And we took a little field trip there, and I taught them one of the songs that I had been taught by my teacher in Korea at this location next to the waterfall. And you know, I find that students really start to pay attention to this text as this living, breathing organism, you know, that is in dialogue with the natural world. Some of the passages that we looked at talk about birds, and they talk about bodies of water. And so they were really experiencing that in a somatic way when we were out there. So those are some of the ways that I try to, you know, convey to my students the living nature of these oral traditions, and the way that that they continue to be performed today. And another brief example is we have these shijo workshops. So shijo is a lyric tradition in Korea, and it's continuing to be written today, both in the written form, and it's also performed as song. And so I have my students write shijo. If they know Korean, they can write it in the Korean language, but if not, they can also write it in English using the syllabic form, similar to how students here in the US oftentimes have a haiku day at school. So that's one other way, you know, to have them understand that this is a living tradition that they can be a part of and that they can extend as well. And it's not something that's simply in the past or is something for the history books.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think, you know, it's so important if you're able to and you have access to, of course, learn your own people's oral traditions, and of course be inspired by other cultures orators as well. Maybe just one thing I'll add is you know, we're taught so much that to be writers we have to read, but I think it's equally true that to be writers that we have to listen, and engaging with the oral involves attuning our ear, to the world and one of our most important senses. And so, I think listen to, whether it be waterfalls or the more than human world, listen to people having conversations on the subway, listen to, the speech and narrative patterns of, folks that you talk with and are in conversation with. So, just deeply listen and, a whole nother, I think, aesthetic world will come alive.
Yes, we will all continue to listen. Thank you all so much for this conversation. Believe Foblia is going to close us out. Thank you all again. It was really enlightening.
Thank you all so, so much. This was truly such a wonderful and powerful conversation. Like, hearing tidbits of your all's childhoods and your cultures and your understanding of transformative decolonial practices to a brighter future is just so wonderful. And I feel so lucky and honored to be part of this conversation and witness everything. Thank you all. And if you guys want to know more about AAWW, feel free to check out our social media and our Instagram, our website to see future events, and of course our margins as well. And yes, thank you so much.